Good morning. I'm Harley Schlanger from the LaRouche Organization with your daily video update for May 25th, 2023. Yesterday, I spoke about the arrogant delusions which shaped the discussion that took place at the recent G7 summit in Hiroshima, and also the general strategic posturing that's coming from the Anglo-American transatlantic world. Today, I'm going to be talking about the battle that's evolving between the concept of, quote, de-risking, unquote, and de-dollarization. Now, if you're following the results of these summits, you'll have noticed two contradictory and mutually exclusive pathways are emerging. The transatlantic, for example, led by the US and the UK, is pushing for permanent war and a global financial policy, which they're now calling de-risking, to defend their unipolar order. On the other side, we're seeing a deepening alliance between Russia, China, and the nations of the global south, which were once called the non-aligned nations. And for them, it's full speed ahead for de-dollarization and for trade and investment policies in national currencies to fund physical development of their economies. This is a decided move against the neo-imperial, neo-colonial approach of the unipolar order. Now let's start with the G7 summit, the European Union defense ministers, and a number of other bilateral and multilateral meetings taking place among the transatlantic powers. Their whole push is for more arms and money for Ukraine for the war against Russia, and more sanctions against Russia, and threats against China. Now, what they're talking about with China is now they're using the word de-risking rather than decoupling. Now, there's a reason for that. There's a recognition that a full-scale decoupling of Western economies with China, as is going on with Russia, would be a disaster for the West. There's no replacement yet for what they need from China, and as well for the international relations between the West and the Chinese. But they intend to break China from Russia. That's what they would like. At the same time, they need to rebuild the supply chains outside of China, which is not likely given the collapse of the physical economy of the transatlantic nations. They also are trying to figure out how to lure the global south away from Russia and China. So how can they do this? Well, there's an editorial in the Financial Times about this conjuncture in which they praise the permanent war scenario that developed at the G7 summit. And they also said there must be full support for Zelensky, full support to defeat Russia in the war in Ukraine, as well as warnings to stop China, or warnings to China to stop its so-called aggressive economic coercion, which is a rich thing coming from the nations that use sanctions to destroy any country which refuses to go along with them. But they also recognize in this Financial Times editorial the problems they're having with the global south. And so they are stuck with this problem of how do you counter the economic cooperation which is deepening between Russia and China and the nations of the global south, which is based on cooperation for economic development. So they write, quote, stronger dialogue will only go so far. In other words, the rhetoric about we want to work with you is meaningless. So stronger dialogue will only go so far. The G7 need to follow through on promises to support developing nations with investment and climate finance. The G7 will need to accompany its words with money and greater detail, unquote. All right, let's get real. There's no commitment for money that will be forthcoming, except for green policies, which the global south doesn't really want. This is all rhetorical window dressing for winning them away from Russia and China. But the global south does not want wind power and solar power. This is not an effective entry point for relations with them because it will only increase the debt while lowering the potential productivity of those countries. And the Global South leaders will see this as an excuse to grab more resources with a friendly face. So further, the Global South is not about to accept lectures about democracy coming from countries which are promoting war and chaos. Now further, there's no funds that will be available. There's tightening credit, qualitative tightening, which is the policy of the Federal Reserve and the central banks to deal with inflation. And you see the crisis in terms of the debt ceiling debate in the United States. What's the best scenario they have for achieving a deal on the debt ceiling? Well, it's the proverbial kicking the can down the road, making a deal to cut some spending here in return for raising the debt ceiling. This isn't going to solve the problem. Do they really think the leaders of the Global South, with centuries of experience dealing with European colonialism and vulture capitalism from the West, do you think they're unaware of the growing financial and economic crisis in the West? You think they don't know that they're going to be promised something which will never be delivered? Further, the Global South leaders can read The Economist, which is a mouthpiece for the City of London, which has an article with the headline, "What Happens If America Defaults on Its Debt? An Unimaginable Eventuality Becomes All Too Imaginable." And it goes on to say that this possible default would lead to a collapse of the stock market, a surge in unemployment, and global panic, with the net result that draconian austerity will be necessary for the West as well as the rest of the world, which has been under conditions of austerity thanks to the International Monetary Fund for the last decades. Now, to enforce this, the UK Foreign Secretary cleverly is on a tour of South America to push the green agenda, but also to warn them against any alliance with Russia and China, not allowing the Belt and Road Initiative into South America. So while the G7 nations are therefore pushing war and de-risking, that is austerity, the march for de-dollarization is accelerating. Let me just give you a few examples. There's a Eurasian Economic Forum, which is going on yesterday and today, which is being attended by 54 nations. And it comes at a moment where the Russians have reported that they have the lowest inflation rate in Europe, 2.3%, compared to double digits for the United Kingdom, for example. Now, Putin, in his speech, reported on the successful advance of Eurasian integration, of the benefits of mutual cooperation, of the role of the role of associations such as the BRICS, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, ASEAN, and the Eurasian Economic Forum. He spoke of the contrast between the development of new transportation corridors and energy cooperation versus policies such as blowing up the North Sea pipelines and imposing the anti-production green agenda. All of this was clear to the leaders and well received. Then he concluded his talk by talking about sweeping changes in international finance, the move to a new decentralized global financial system based on trade and investment in national currencies. In other words, de-dollarization. Now, this whole thing is based on an end to the unipolar order's insistence that the economy be based on the dollar and geopolitics. And this is being rejected across the Global South. There are all kinds of meetings and new agreements, the latest between Iran and Indonesia to expand trade based on using national currencies. You have the visit of the Russian Prime Minister Mishustin to China, where he met with Xi Jinping, and he also met with Dilma Rousseff, who is the new head of the BRICS Development Bank. The discussion was how to increase the trade and development, which has grown between Russia and China over 30% in the first 2 months of 2023. He reported that Russia and China now, 70% of the trade between them is based on yuan-ruble transactions. We also see the Saudis, who have welcomed the Russians into OPEC Plus, have applied for membership in the BRICS, and are very closely tied now with China in diplomatic moves for development of Southwest Asia. The Saudis are also taking the yuan for their oil sales. You have Brazil-China trade is now in yuan. The CEO of the Russian bank VTB said yesterday that the yuan will replace the dollar as the world reserve currency in the years ahead. And I think many nations realize that and are looking toward that as an eventuality. Now, this will happen unless the U.S. and the United Kingdom use wars, coups, regime change, assassinations, and destabilizations to stop it. Is that what they're going to tell the Global South? Stick with us or we'll overthrow you? Now, it's time for the people in the West to boot out these arrogant elitists behind the unipolar order and join with the Global South. The basis for this is to engage in dialogue around something like the 10 principles of Helga Zepp-LaRouche, the 10 principles of a new international security and development architecture, which will be linked below. Hello, thanks for watching. Be sure to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you don't miss any of our videos. Support our independence to produce videos like these. Become a member of the LaRouche organization at thelarouche.org/member. By becoming a member for $25 or more, you'll get special access to the EIR Alert Daily Briefing and Weekly Magazine, which is what I read to stay on top of things.